ATA webinar presentation, Volunteering, Making Your Investment of Time Worthwhile. Thank you all for being here. It's a lovely day in Washington, D.C. after being so cold. And I hope you all are having great weather like we are. But before I forget, thank you, I want to thank the people who are watching this as an on-demand webinar. It will be free, so you can always come back and watch it again. My name is Mary David, and I am the webinar coordinator at ATA headquarters, which is just outside of Washington. As I said, nice weather. There are a few things to cover before we start. First, this webinar is being recorded. All of you will receive a link to the recording by email, and usually that's within 24 hours of the event. So you'll have the opportunity to replay the presentation. So if you're taking notes, don't feel like you have to grab everything, because you can go back, and with the recording you can obviously go back and forth and catch up things in a particular spot. So don't get anxious about taking notes. Today's webinar is scheduled to last 60 minutes. Occasionally a presentation goes a bit longer, but remember, if you have to leave on time, you'll be able to come back to catch up on the recording. All attendees are muted. We have found this is the best way, almost the only way, to keep going forward smoothly. But please do ask questions, and we really want you to ask questions. You can do this at any time during the webinar by typing in your questions into the question box, a question pane that you should see on your screen. We're going to collect all of these for a Q&A session at the end, and we'll get to as many questions as we have time for. We do have a handout for today's presentation, and you'll get a copy of this by email as an attachment. So again, watch for that in your email, in your inbox, because sometimes the attachments end up flagging the email as spam. So you be sure to look out for it. And it's also available for download right from the ATA website. And with that, I would like to turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Jamie Hartz.
Thanks, Mary. Like Mary has said, my name is Jamie Hartz. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you today about volunteering and about investing your time and your energy as a volunteer. I'll start with a little bit of background about myself and how I am involved and have been involved as a volunteer before we get started. So first things first, I'm an ATA certified Spanish to English translator. I'm a freelancer, and I do legal and commercial translations. I have been freelancing since 2013 when I started a master's at Kent State University, and now I've been full-time for almost 3 years since 2015 when I finished my degree and I moved to lovely and somewhat warm and sunny Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I live now. As far as volunteering goes, I would describe myself as an avid volunteer and sometimes an overcommitted one. And I think I have been since pretty much day one. So as far as ATA goes, I started volunteering pretty much the day I walked in the door. My first ATA conference was in 2012, and I met a colleague who was really passionate about starting an effort to welcome newbies to the translation and interpreting industry. And the Savvy Newcomer blog was born, and I sort of helped her get the effort off the ground, and now I volunteer as an editor and an author for the blog for our various posts. Closely tied to that, I also serve now as one of the coordinators of Buddies Welcome Newbies, which is a program at the annual conference where we pair first-time attendees who've never attended before with people who have attended to kind of make them feel welcome, give them a friendly face. And I'm currently the secretary of my local translation association, which is the Delaware Valley Translators Association here in the Philadelphia area. And then last but not least, I'm currently a member of the ATA ad hoc website committee. We're looking to revamp the association's website. When it's all down in writing, it kind of sounds like a lot, and it kind of begs the question, why do I do this if I'm not being paid to do so? I would say there's a lot more to the answer than I could cover in just one short hour, but to sum it up, I want to say that I've seen my personal and my professional life just enriched in so many different ways by volunteering that I can't imagine not being involved. I've met basically my translation family, my community through volunteering, and I've seen other people benefit from the work I do, and I've also seen my own business grow as a result of it. So I'm pretty passionate about volunteering because of what I've seen it do for my own career, but also because I have a sense of the needs that are out there, and I think that was instilled in me from a pretty young age. My parents are very avid volunteers. I've seen volunteering take place from my church to a food kitchen to a neighborhood, and I've just had the opportunity to see as I was growing up the value that volunteers bring to an organization, and then also, unfortunately, kind of the way that an organization can break down if we have a lack of volunteers or a lack of effort put into that. So I wanted to have sort of a space, and I kind of alluded to this in the abstract to this webinar, for people who wanted to share stories or thoughts about volunteering, to have sort of a collaborative area, and that's a webinar is not particularly conducive to that. We can't really have a conversation on here. So the solution I've come up with is to kind of use Twitter to have some interaction if you're interested. I would love to have you use, I've put ATA in my own Twitter handles, as well as a hashtag ATA volunteers. That's on this slide, but it's also at the bottom right hand of every other slide for the rest of the webinar, so that if anything occurs to you in the next hour or after that that you want to share with the other listeners or share it with me, you can tweet at me or you can tweet at ATA. You can use the hashtag, and I'll check it out after the webinar, and I would love to just continue the conversation. I think that would be a cool way to bounce ideas off of each other, find some accountability in volunteering, and also just to find some support. Excuse me. So feel free, you can use that media, you can share stories of volunteering, tips that you think are helpful, ways that you feel inspired to volunteer, anything that you can fit into, I think it's 140 characters or less. The scheduling this webinar is really timely, which was recommended by Mary, who you just heard from at ATA, because we're right in the middle of National Volunteer Week here in the US. It's April 15th to the 21st. So this is a great time if you're interested in other thoughts, other information about volunteering. A couple of ATA's recent podcasts have really focused in on volunteering experiences and the value of volunteering, why things are so important, why volunteering is so important, and tips about how to do it. So I think it was the last slide. There's a link to that, and you'll find it on the handout as well. Just before we get started, I want to give you an idea of what my main points are going to be. First, I want to make the case for volunteering. I think I just want to explain how we do it and why we do it, although I think that because you're here, you're already going to be somewhat inclined to be a volunteer, but I want to talk about the motivations. And then I'll talk about some of the different ways we can make the most of volunteer opportunities. I would say that the personal or business gain is not the main reason that we volunteer, but they can often be a side effect, so we'll talk about that. And then I'll also throw out some specific ideas of where you can get involved as a volunteer, whether as a translator and interpreter, as a freelancer, maybe you're in-house as a project manager or something like that, and regardless of what language you work in. I think we all have a philosophy of volunteering, whether we think about it, whether we've hashed it out or not, even if our philosophy is just I'll do it all or I'll let someone else do it. So I just want to explore in the next hour some of the ins and outs of volunteering so that we can just develop our ideas about it, how it should be done, where we can contribute our time and talents. And I think that's all going to be for the good of our organization and of our community and ultimately for ourselves as well. So first things first, what is a volunteer? A volunteer is a person who gives something for free. I like to think of volunteer work as a donation. It could be of your time, of your services, of your energy, or just any kind of effort for the benefit of other people, and that would be for free. Usually people volunteer for a cause that we find worthy or deserving. Could be a nonprofit, could be a religious group, any kind of organization whose goals and beliefs are at least somewhat aligned with ours. Okay, that's what volunteering is, but why do we do it? In preparing for today, I researched a ton about the motivations that lead people to volunteer, and I asked a lot of my volunteer colleagues and friends why they do it, and for as many people as you can ask, you'll come up with that many answers as to why people volunteer, but I've tried to boil them down a little bit into some main categories. So the first reason, and I think maybe the first one you'd think of, that people volunteer is what I would think of as a feel-good motivation. They want a sense of that they've fulfilled a duty, maybe that they've given back somehow, just the idea of contributing when we know we're doing okay and we want to give to others somehow to make ourselves feel good. And I think that behind this reasoning is just simple altruism, philanthropy, just the desire to do good by others. A second reason that we volunteer is a pass it on type of mentality. We put in time and effort for free because we want to instill the idea in others that that's a valuable way to spend our time. And because we realize that someday we may be in need of another person to step up and to serve in that same capacity. So we're kind of operating on almost a karma-like motivation. I've heard of volunteer service as talked about as kind of a social contract. So there's kind of this idea that there's an unwritten understanding as a society or as an organization that we can't do what we're doing without the work of volunteers. So that's pass it on. sometimes people also choose to volunteer because of a sort of keep things afloat type of a reasoning. And so basically that means you see a need and you either decide to fill it or you reluctantly maybe agree to fill it. And frankly, I think one reason that a lot of people, if you ask them, would cite as why they volunteer is because, oh, well, someone asked me to do it. And that's a perfectly valid reason. So when we see needs in an organization or in a community and we choose to be the person that fulfills those needs, I think actually is one of the times when we find the most fulfillment out of those commitments, is because we know the value we're bringing to the team and we know the needs that we're filling. Another motivation behind volunteering is to gain experience. It might sound kind of counterintuitive because you'll think, well, how would working for free help me get work experience? But a lot of the skills that we use and develop as volunteers can be really transferable to other tasks, even in our professional lives. So things like time management, communication skills, speaking skills, even learning to delegate. You might think in like the world outside of translation and interpreting of, for example, getting experience in something like Habitat for Humanity, where you're contributing your time and your skills, but you're also learning valuable skills about building, construction, things like that. And then in the translation world, that might kind of take the form of something like editing for a newsletter for your local association, or maybe writing for a blog and gaining writing skills like that. And I actually think that this specific point about volunteering to get experience is really well taken and really applicable to our context, because it's one of the biggest ways that we can gain respect in our profession. So translation and interpreting is mainly built on a contractor model where many of us working as translators and interpreters are freelancers. And so the way to gain recognition in our field is not necessarily just to do our jobs well. So as, for instance, maybe a literary translator might have awards they could win, but as a legal interpreter or translator, some of the biggest ways to earn credibility in your field are actually going to be first to earn credentials and maybe get some education, but also to become involved in your professional association. So even if you think about the board of directors of ATA, which are all volunteers, by the way, I think they would say that the way they've gotten to where they are, to a very respectable position, is not just by doing their jobs well, though of course that's important, but by contributing time and effort as volunteers. And that leads well into the next reason that people volunteer, which is to expand their network, to meet other people. And one of the reasons that this is such a big motivator is because a lot of times the volunteer work you're doing leads to really valuable mutual connections between you and the people that you're serving with. So you'll often get to meet people who have similar values, similar goals as you. So this is a good way just to build community in this profession where so many of us find ourselves isolated, and a lot of us are also introverts and find it intimidating to be trying to make connections. So volunteering gives us a sort of common ground to start off with. For me, volunteering is a really obvious choice, but when I think harder about why I do it, what the question of why people volunteer, I think that the thing I think about is that I can't imagine the world I live in, the organization that the ATA is an organization, my church, my community, without some of the systems that are run on volunteers. And so I think if I can't imagine my life without those things, then it's a no-brainer that I want to be doing my part to keep those things going. So for instance, if I can't imagine doing my job in a vacuum here, in my home office without other translators, if I didn't have the people that I know through ATA and without the resources that it gives me, then I have a vested interest in investing in the association and making sure that those kinds of support survive on for the rest of my career and for the future generations that are going to benefit from it. And so that's why I'm so willing to give my time for free, and I think also why a lot of other ATA volunteers would say the same thing. So those are the positives, but what are some of the barriers that keep people from volunteering? Whether it be keep them from starting to volunteer or keep them from continuing. I think one of the biggest reasons from my perspective that people don't volunteer is going to be a lack of time. So we all have lives that are constantly on the run. Our jobs are full of tight deadlines. We're rushing from place to place. We have 6 million miscellaneous tasks that we already don't have time for. So how do we find time to contribute as volunteers? And along with that, some of the volunteer commitments that we would consider doing just don't line up with our schedules. So that's one barrier. Another barrier to volunteering is just not knowing the need that's out there. So people don't like to feel useless. They don't want to feel that they're wasting their time. And so I think sometimes we don't get involved with volunteer commitments because we don't see how our time could be well spent or how our time would be utilized. And then I think sometimes we also avoid or withdraw maybe from volunteer opportunities because of other just little frustrations of the job. Maybe we don't get along with the people. Maybe we don't like having to jump through hoops to get things done. Or maybe just our interests simply are changing and we want to spend our time in different ways. And then one last barrier in my mind to volunteering is perceived limitations that we have for ourselves. So in the same sense that we feel like we're all short on time, I think people often will feel that they're limited in what they can contribute as a volunteer. So maybe, for instance, if you're new to the profession, you're not sure what you bring to the table, or if you live outside the US and you feel like you need to be living in the United States to be a part of the American Translators Association. So those are all perfectly valid reasons to be wary of volunteering, but I think they're also really manageable. So I'm hoping that by talking here about the opportunities and the value of volunteering, that you can just kind of see how those barriers can get overcome or how you can work around them. And I think everyone really benefits in the end from that. So I have a couple of statistics for you because I think we, within our profession, we don't really have the numbers to gauge how many people volunteer, but I think it's worth thinking about how many people volunteer outside of translation and interpreting and just where volunteering takes place. So BLS, the United States Bureau of Labor and Statistics, I found it recently conducts a survey, I think it's every couple of years, about volunteering. And I read some interesting facts. There was this Business Insider article that you see linked to there about the report. So I just want to throw out a couple of interesting tidbits. First is that 24.9% of Americans spent time volunteering in 2015. So that's just under 1/4 of the population. And that number had actually been on the decline for recent years. Another tidbit is that people across all the age groups are most likely to volunteer for religious organizations, and the most common volunteer tasks are collecting, preparing, or serving food, and tutoring or teaching. I found it very interesting that individuals with higher levels of education are more likely to volunteer. So I won't try to make any kind of statement about that, but I think we can say that well-educated people are more likely to volunteer, and you can deduce from that what you will. As for the question of who in the world volunteers, I think as we start thinking about where our services or our time can be best used, it's cool to think about other professions that involve volunteers. So you'll see in the picture, I don't know how it works in other countries exactly, but at least in the US, we have a lot of volunteer firefighters. So like the ones in the picture. And the source I found online said that more firefighters are unpaid than are paid. Actually, 69% of all firefighters are volunteers. And so I think as we start to think about this, it's kind of inspiring to see a volunteer activity like that and think about what kind of motivation it must take to be willing to do something so dangerous and so high risk for free. And so I can definitely appreciate that and be glad that I don't have to do that kind of work, and I'm more than happy to contribute to my other volunteer work and be doing my part. And then on a more low-key level, we have groups like Doctors Without Borders, and we have lawyers. A lot of bar associations will encourage lawyers and attorneys to do many, many hours worth of pro bono work every year for free. And actually some studies are showing that paying people to do certain jobs, and I think maybe firefighting is probably one of them, can actually inhibit them from offering their time because people want to share, people want to give back, and volunteering allows them an opportunity to feel good about what they're contributing. So I think we can draw from this that a lot of aspects of the world are run on volunteers, and certainly not the least of those is a nonprofit organization just like ATA or one of your local associations. All right, next on the agenda is just a broad look at what volunteering can mean in our context. So obviously I would encourage you to be a volunteer in your community or in your town, but I'm going to focus in on our profession, translation and interpreting, so professional volunteer opportunities. One of the things to look at is, do I want to get involved in volunteer work versus do I want to do pro bono work? And they have very different needs, different benefits to each one of them. So to make a distinction, by volunteering, I mean getting involved like with an association like ATA in any way, whether serving in an event, organizing a program, working for a division, or serving with a local chapter. And then by pro bono work, I mean offering your services that you would do for a living, but offering them for free. So there are definitely some important questions to answer and consider when you look into pro bono work, and we're going to talk about those on a later slide. But for example, I'm talking there about something like interpreting at like a legal aid clinic or a medical clinic, or translating a document for a nonprofit for free. Another distinction to make is between in-person and digital work. So I mentioned that one of the barriers that we see to volunteering might be like a physical or a geographical perceived limitation. So I want to just point out that sometimes volunteering is done digitally. So for example, if you were to moderate a blog, or even if you were to just serve on a committee, those things can be done virtually online. Whereas others will require you to be present in person, like setting up for an event or tearing down for an event or helping out for something in person. And then finally, I think it's important to recognize that a volunteer activity is still a volunteer activity, whether it's a one-time shindig or a long-term commitment. So sometimes you might agree to help hand out flyers at an event, or serve, in the community, serve food to people in need on a Saturday. As a one-time commitment, and that's service. And other times you might have the capacity to commit to a multiple-year term as like a treasurer or something like that. Excuse me, or you would maybe agree to do a newsletter every month with updates for your division. And so those are more long-term, ongoing commitments. And I think that, again, by making this distinction, we're able to eliminate another one of the barriers that we talked about, which is not having enough time. Because this is just an acknowledgement that sometimes volunteering means giving up a Saturday afternoon instead of hours and hours of work every month. All right, so let's say I've done my job and I've convinced you that volunteering is a worthwhile use of your limited free time. What volunteer opportunities are out there, and how do I go about finding them? The first place, of course, that I'm going to mention that I'm going to talk about to search for volunteer opportunities is going to be ATA. I'm involved, and I find it really a valuable use of my time to volunteer within ATA, and I realize that it would not exist without volunteers. And of course, we have fabulous staff at ATA, but without the volunteers, we wouldn't be able to have things like social media, the conference, certification even. A lot of that is also run on volunteers. So be thinking about your interests, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of the different areas of ATA that are run on volunteer work. The first and most obvious area, and each of these is links in your handout, is divisions and chapters. So ATA divisions are special interest groups. They're categorized by like language or subject area. So like we have a Slavic language division, I think there's a Japanese language division, a medical division, educators division, and so forth. And each of those has a leadership team that runs its events, its meetings, its social media, communications, all that stuff. And so some areas that you could get involved in a division would be things like editing for a newsletter, offering to contribute on social media, maybe helping with some administrative work, writing articles for a blog, or even serving on the leadership of the division. And then we have chapters or affiliated groups, which are regional associations, and that's grouped by geographical location. So I already mentioned DVTA, which is my local chapter, and we have all kinds of volunteer opportunities all throughout the year, from writing a blog post to helping on our social media committee, to if we have an event, we will often ask volunteers to sit at the registration table and check people in. Another really cool volunteer opportunity within ATA that I think gives people a chance to sort of tie together personal and professional interests is school outreach. So the school outreach program is kind of founded on the idea that if we want to raise awareness about our profession, then we should start with the younger generation and kind of raise them up knowing the value of our profession and helping them understand what we do, and maybe even inspiring them to become translators and interpreters someday. So the school outreach program offers resources that encourage people to reach out to teachers or to students to volunteer to speak in a classroom, and that can be at any grade level, public or private, high school, college, anything. And you talk about translation and interpreting, and I think this is a really cool idea because any one of us, I think if we think hard enough about it, can come up with an opportunity where we can do school outreach. Because even if you don't have kids in school, you could have grandkids, nieces, nephews. And for me, I have a lot of friends who are teachers in my local area. So this is a really fun opportunity for you to get out in your community, do some volunteering, and then teach some kids about your career as well. Other ATA volunteer opportunities exist at the ATA conference itself, which is held every fall. So speaking, at least for Buddies Welcome Newbies, the program I've been involved in, every single year we are always asking volunteers from our newbie crowd if they would want to show up a couple of minutes early and help us just do various tasks. So like help manage the crowd, tell people where to go, hand out some of the paperwork we give, like distribute materials we're going to use and things like that. And I think that for an in-person event like that, volunteering is a really good way for them to break the ice, especially for these newbies. It forces them to get to know some people. And so, especially if you are intimidated by big events like that or by environments where you don't know anyone, volunteering for that situation is an awesome way to just jump right in. And then one final area within ATA that I've thought of to get involved is through committees. We have committees on everything from ethics to public relations to certification. So if you check out ATA's website and contact the people who are involved with those committees, they can tell you the best ways to get involved, whether to support the committees or to join them. Okay, so then there's also advocacy, where you might get involved with something that you're passionate about, whether related to translation or interpreting, or whether it be for people who speak other languages in your local area, advocating for them. Could be in your community or through your work. And then there's finally volunteering your services, so pro bono work. There's a lot of opportunities out there for both translators and interpreters, and I think if you just keep your eyes open, you'll start to see them a lot. So one example is like a mission or a clinic trip of some kind. So for example, last summer in my local area, a group of doctors and nurses went from my church and took a 10-day trip to staff a medical clinic. And this was in like a remote village of Guatemala that was underserved. And I went along to serve as a medical interpreter in a volunteer capacity. So I had been interpreting off and on, and I hadn't done medical in a while since I had taken a course and worked in grad school, but it was a challenge, but it was a really rewarding way to offer some, what I had, the ability to interpret for doctors who would not have been able to serve their patients without it. And then other opportunities for pro bono service might be something like a legal clinic, a medical clinic, translating TED Talks is a big thing, or a nonprofit translation group like the ones I have listed there, which are the Rosetta Foundation, Kiva, Translators Without Borders. I think Kiva actually does microloans, and they also need translators to help translate like the abstracts for the loans. All right, so this is the crux. This is the moment you've been waiting for. You've found your groove as a volunteer. You start giving back, but you're not sure how it's actually supposed to help you or benefit you. The key in my mind to making this type of work for you is that rather than to ask yourself, what's in it for me, you ask yourself, what does it say about me? And then how do I communicate that to other people? So volunteering says that you're kind, you're giving, you care about other people, but aside from that, the fact that you volunteer actually says a lot about you in a professional capacity. First, it tells people that you care about your job. When you get involved in a professional association and you have something on your resume other than, when you put your memberships rather than just American Translators Association member, it communicates that you are committed to your career. You're in it for the long haul. And it also says that you care about and you are wanting to interact with the other people in your career. So you're actively making an effort to advance your career. I would say that volunteering also tells people that you are not a stranger to hard work. So regardless of what type of volunteering work you've done, I think having worked as a volunteer for free in some way is going to tell people, including employers or clients, that you know how to put in time and you know how to do good work. One other thing volunteering says about you is that you're a team player. If you've ever served on any kind of a volunteer team, so for example, the Savvy Newcomer blog team works together to make sure that our blog authors get contacted, our articles get edited, our posts get set up, publications get moderated, and so forth. If you've ever worked on a team like that, then you're communicating that you know how to work with others and that you can be, and that can be for employers a really valuable point to communicate when they're looking to make sure that the person they hire, whether it be for a job or for a project, is going to be a good collaborator. They want to make sure they have someone with a healthy work ethic, someone with good people skills. And to me, there's just no better way to demonstrate that than through volunteering. So another way to enjoy benefits from volunteering is to find opportunities that you can gain education and experience through it. And that could take the form of just asking a lot of questions of your volunteer colleagues or teammates, or making sure that you're involved in a volunteer group where you're surrounded by people who you respect, maybe with more experience than you, people you can learn from, or even something just as simple as volunteering at a professional event in your area where you might be serving for free, but you also get to attend part of the event for free. That can get you some experience and education as well. And then finally, I want to cover the idea of showcasing or like leveraging your volunteer experience, but I want to just emphasize that volunteer work isn't done for economic benefit, but at the same time, I would say I can trace a lot of my clients back to connections I've made through volunteer work in some capacity. So while it's not the main purpose for what we do, I have some ideas about how you can use volunteer experience to kind of kindle your business growth as well. One of those things is to just put it on your resume, put it on your LinkedIn profile. Simple as that. There's a section in LinkedIn for volunteer experience, and I always include in my resume a section on volunteering and memberships. So you can't make it too large a portion, and obviously work experience or education would probably come first, but if you serve on a committee, write that in. If you are editing for a blog, write that in. You can make it a bulleted list. You could include it within the association membership, wherever that's listed, whatever you think comes across best. And then along that same vein, I would say to keep a list of the positions, like the volunteer positions that you have been involved with. I started doing this actually in college. I was involved in so many clubs, again, overcommitted, that I actually kept a document on my computer that listed all of the different clubs I was in and what I did for each one and the years that I was involved in. And that was really hugely helpful when I was applying to jobs, applying to grad schools. I didn't have to remember everything that I was doing. And that also, if you do this for your volunteer experiences, is going to help you pinpoint the experiences and commitments that are best suited to the job that you're looking to get, or maybe the client that you're looking to win over. And then one other way that you can leverage volunteer experiences is by asking volunteer members to be references. So sometimes a job or a client application is going to ask you to provide maybe 1 to 3 references. And I think especially if you're newer to translation and interpreting, or if maybe like your PMs don't respond to emails, or if your current clients speak another language than the one you're looking to contact, it can be kind of hard to figure out who to put. And so I would say that you can put down volunteer connections for this. So you first obviously want to ask permission from them. And of course, the person's only going to be able to speak to the capacity in which they know you. But why not provide references of people you volunteered with? Because they can vouch for your work ethic. They can vouch for your timeliness. And sometimes they can also vouch for your skills in certain areas. So just to sum up the idea of showcasing yourself, of like leveraging volunteer experiences, I would say that the best way you can make volunteer work for you is to give 150%, go above and beyond. So volunteer tasks can't take priority over paid work most of the time, and obviously family time is more important, but it's important not to do slipshod work either when you do volunteering, because people are going to take note when you do great work as a volunteer, as well as when you do great work as a translator and interpreter, but not everyone's going to get to see you in your work capacity. So volunteering is a really great opportunity to just showcase some of your other skills and abilities. There are a few things that I think every volunteer needs to be aware of just to avoid when we're giving our time. So one thing to avoid would be burnout or over-serving, just the idea of giving too much time. So it's important to realize that a part of volunteering can be delegating. Like, you've got committee chairs that are volunteering, but they're going to always share the burden of their work with the other people in their committee because they can't do it all themselves. And the thing to realize, I think, about burnout is that there is always going to be more work to be done, but we are limited. We're limited by our time, and sometimes you just can't do it all. So there are going to be times when you have to say no to good things, to good opportunities, and that's okay. And I think people understand that. And so I actually like to think about kind of a threefold balance in my work. As a translator, as a freelancer, I allocate part of my time first to paid work. And then, of course, I have to allocate some time to professional development or continuing education. And then third, I allocate time to volunteering. And there has to be the right balance of all those areas. And even just on your resume, you have to see the right balance of all those areas. And if not, then one or all of them is going to suffer if you don't have the right balance. So the question of how much is too much volunteering is just one that every person has to answer for themselves. But just consider your other commitments that you have, consider what kind of a work-life balance you need to have, and look at the nature of every commitment before you jump into it, because you want to avoid burnout beforehand. It's something that all volunteers, I think, are susceptible to, unfortunately. Another item to avoid is taking on volunteer activities that you don't have qualifications to do. And you might say, oh, well, I'm doing it for free, so it doesn't matter if it's good, it doesn't matter if I have the qualifications to do it. But I think actually one of the biggest things that's going to contribute to how quickly we burn out is whether we enjoy the commitment and whether we find it too challenging, or whether we're, in over our heads, it's too much of a burden. So when I say lack of qualification here, I mean, for example, if you're not great with numbers, you probably don't want to be a treasurer. If you don't already spend a lot of time on social media, then maybe you don't want to join a social media committee. But then this also goes for pro bono work. So it might be a good opportunity for you to gain some experience, but I would be careful about taking on a legal job pro bono if you're not already practiced as a legal translator or an interpreter. So on this topic, I would also just caution you to think about the point of giving 150%. If you're taking on a volunteer activity that you're not great at, will you really be able to put your best foot forward and represent yourself well? And then finally, a third issue to avoid is what I've called here detracting, for lack of a better term. And by that, I mean taking away possible paid work of other professionals because you're doing something for free. I think it's important to realize that what you might consider a charitable, like a charity or a nonprofit that you want to volunteer for, might actually have a budget and might have been paying someone else to do translation or interpreting. So by offering your services for free, you might be endangering another person's paid work, basically. So to be able to consider that, I think first you want to ask yourself, what's the organization's budget? Most of those things are, available, or you can at least ask about them. Does the organization already have translators and interpreters working for them? And then finally, if you don't do the job, what's going to happen? Either it won't get done, or if you don't do the job, will the organization have such a low budget that they're going to have to ask someone to do a subpar job, or ask someone who's not really qualified to do it? This is a really, really hard balance to strike, and it's an issue to wrestle with for the ages. But I think most importantly, you just want to think the opportunity through, think your decision through, and just be able to rationalize it either way. On things to avoid, I have an example, just one last point I think covers all of these issues. So when I was in grad school, I, through school, heard about a volunteer opportunity at a legal aid clinic nearby, and I thought, okay, this is a great chance to get some experience, learn about legal work. Maybe I'll be able to interact with some other legal translators. And so I contacted this clinic, and they invited me to come to their office, learn about what they did. And right off the bat, I was definitely getting it over my head, because their first thing they asked me to do was they handed me a 60-page document, printed, physical page document, and they asked me to translate it at home for free on my own time. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do, so I took the 60 pages and I told them, okay, I'll do my best. They told me there's no deadline, there's no timeline for this, just do what you can. And what happened was I basically went home and I put the pages on my desk, and they sat there for a week and 2 weeks and 3 weeks. And finally, after a few weeks, I thought, okay, I need to sit down and look at these. And when I did, I realized, well, they're, first of all, physical documents. So I can't use a CAT tool for these. I can't leverage any of the translation I've done. It'll be very hard to reformat everything. Some of the words are illegible, and it was very legalese for me at the time as well. So I think this situation kind of covers all three of the issues. Burnout. I would have burned out really quickly if I tried to take this project on. Lack of qualification, because they were asking me to do something that I wasn't at the time understanding. And then detracting, because a document of that size, I think, should have been handled differently by a trained translator who could do a really quality job, and then hopefully been compensated for their time. So in the end, what happened was I wound up sitting down. I did a few pages of the translation so that I could say I tried. And then I called the clinic and I told them, I don't feel comfortable with this. I don't think I have time for it. And I'm really sorry. I feel that I've committed to this, but it's not within the scope of my ability. And they were very understanding. They recognized that they had asked a lot of me. And so we ended up on good terms, and I was able to find other ways to contribute to their efforts. So we are wrapping up here. And I'm looking forward to answering questions and reading about your stories about volunteering. But I have a couple of just like wrap-up points to keep in mind as you think about volunteering. The first one is to start by considering your skills. If you're not sure how to get started as a volunteer, just think about what you're good at. Are you organized? Are you a people person? Are you a good leader? Maybe you're just a strong note taker. You would make a great secretary. We're all, obviously, well, most of us, I would assume, are translators and interpreters, but that doesn't mean we all have the same strengths. And so we can use those strengths to complement each other in embarking on volunteer adventures. Second thing is to know when and how to say no and to set boundaries. So I think this is one of the best ways to avoid burnout, is the ability to decline opportunities. And that's something that I think those of us who are avid volunteers definitely struggle with, but we feel like if we don't say yes to everything that comes our way, then either A, no one will do it, or B, we're going to miss out on some awesome opportunity. The boundaries you set for yourself might be like the time of day. Maybe you decide that 8 to 10 a.m. is going to be my volunteer time. Or maybe it would be the time of year. So your kid's soccer schedule is always busy in whatever season. So you're going to focus on opportunities in a different time of year. Personally, for myself, I find my schedule getting really busy in the fall, because I prepare then for Buddies Welcome Newbies, and I'm getting ready for the conference, and I have other work to do on the side. So when other opportunities come up, I try to make sure that they're going to be able to take a back burner in the fall so that I can focus on those commitments. And then also, when you do make time to do volunteer work, I like to think of it as kind of a hobby. In terms of making time for yourself, it's something I do because I enjoy it rather than because I have to. And this helps me to make time. So I like to use the volunteer opportunities, like if I'm going to maybe sit down to write a blog article for the Savvy Newcomer, or I'm going to edit someone else's article. I use them as breaks from my work, from my paid work, because they're professional things I can do during the workday, but they're easily done at a cafe or on my back porch, and that helps me to want to do them and want to make time for them because I'm enjoying the task that I have at hand. The third thing there is to know the commitment you're getting into. So this goes back again to my 60-page document. Sometimes when we're asked to volunteer for something, we say yes without thinking about it. This has also happened to me where maybe I'll agree to a volunteer position, and then a few weeks or months into the position, I realize I don't know what time frame I've committed myself to. Am I in this for a year? Am I in this for 2 years? Am I never going to get out of this? So before you're too quick to say yes to an opportunity, just make sure that you know what you're getting into. I like to think of it I like to think of volunteering in general as kind of a donation. So I believe in giving to charity, but before I'm going to write out a check, I do my research. I get to know the organization. I want to research where they're spending their money. I want to know what their mission is, what their vision is, and then who else is involved in the organization so that I can gauge for myself whether it's going to be a good fit and whether I'm going to feel good about contributing. And the same goes for volunteering. And then another thing to keep in mind is to just simply fulfill your commitments. Make sure you do what you're going to do. Of course, there are exceptions when you have to step down, like my legal document. But the key is to do stuff you like. I think if a volunteer task doesn't pique your interest at all, it's going to very quickly become a chore and/or an obligation. And then finally, make sure to thank the volunteers in your life. Just as a closing point, if you watch for it, I think you would be amazed at how many of what you would consider vital systems or organizations in the world are volunteer run. So if you are on a volunteer team, or you coordinate volunteers, or you are, benefited or enriched in any way by volunteers, make sure you thank them, because again, the point is we don't get paid, and the best compensation you give, the best payment you can give to a volunteer is just to thank them. So now that I've lost my voice, that wraps up what I've got to say today. I look forward to chatting with you on Twitter, and if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That is fantastic. I have a couple of questions already, but if you haven't already asked your question, do please put them into the questions pane, which you'll find in your control panel. The one I have so far is, you mentioned advocacy earlier on in your presentation as a volunteering opportunity. Can you sort of expand a little bit on that?
Sure. So advocacy is something I don't have a whole lot of experience with, but if you actually look back at last year's ATA conference, this was something that was focused in on really well since the event took place in Washington, D.C. Advocacy in that sense would be going to our lawmakers and educating them about our profession. Could also be educating others about the needs of translators and interpreters, and kind of advocating for people throughout the world, especially those in endangered areas or those in war zones. And it could also take the form of advocating for speakers of other languages who may be at a disadvantage.
Thank you. Getting a few questions, or not comments more, to thank you very much for your very helpful presentation. And somebody else is also asking, do you think people can still volunteer even if they have little or no experience in the field?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think that is one of the best times to get involved as a volunteer, because you're likely to have a little bit more time, and it's going to give you a really good taste of who you might, what you might want to become, where you might want to be headed, because you can interact with so many other volunteer colleagues that way. You can get to know a lot of people, and like I said, volunteering is one way to really earn credibility and gain respect in the profession as well.
Fine, that applies to pro bono as well, of course.
Yes.
And here's another question. Have you got any tips on how to make time for volunteering? Should it be more than once a month, or, have you got any advice in general?
I think it really depends on the person. It depends on your situation and your work-life balance. I think one of my philosophies is to, like I said, use it as a break. And so I like to not just commit to one-time situations, one-time commitments, like the event where I would sit at the registration table. I'm more interested in building relationships through volunteering, and so if you can find something that maybe only involves 1 hour a week, for a 1-year term, 1-year commitment, I think that's a really good place to start, because I think we can all probably find 1 hour throughout our week. And that'll allow you a little bit more continuity to learn what you're doing, get to know the people that you're working with.
Excellent. And then we have an operational question here asking about the recording of the webinar. Yes, very soon after the webinar, a couple of hours after, you will get a link to the recording, and it will also be available on the website. Another question about volunteering. Do you have any tips to approaching my local translation association in order to volunteer for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. As the secretary of DVTA, I can tell you that we get approached by volunteers pretty frequently, and we love it. So reach out to maybe the board of directors of your local association. I'm sure you can find their contact information on their website. Or if you just go to some of their events, try to talk to the people who seem to be in charge and ask them if there's anything you can do to help with the next event. I think one point to make here is that a lot of times as volunteers, we're a little bit scatterbrained maybe. We've got a lot going on. So if you tell someone I'm available to help as a volunteer and they forget, it's okay to just remind them, or, contact someone else if you don't hear back from them.
Okay. What is the best way to set boundaries with clients or institutions? Any tips there?
If the question is, what is the best way to set boundaries between maybe paid work and volunteer work?
I think referring to your 60-page document example,
okay.
That kind of thing.
I think that the best way to do it is to try to use opportunities like that as an education opportunity. So if I had, been thinking on my feet, I could have explained to them, okay, so a 60-page legal document is going to take me this amount of time. If you were to ask for a quote for this, it might cost you this much money. And so for me to contribute this amount of time would require X, Y, and Z. It would take this amount of time. So just to educate the people about what our profession involves and what the volunteer effort that you would have to make would be.
And what it takes, yeah.
Yes.
Somebody here is saying they'd like to volunteer for their local hospital. Do you know if it's difficult to volunteer for hospitals as an interpreter since they're big organizations? Do you have any suggestions on how to access them?
That's a very good question. I think that every hospital will be a little different, but larger ones will have language access departments. So you might consider looking for that, or finding someone who works at the hospital and asking them, if you have a patient with limited English proficiency, what do you do? And they might be able to point you in the right direction. I know that at least in my area, most of our local hospitals have either a language department or they have a translation agency that they're going to for interpreters. But that's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. And one last thing, is it mandatory to be an ATA member in order to volunteer in ATA-related work?
That sounds like a question for Mary, actually. I don't think so. You would want to be a member to be participating in a committee, but not necessarily just to volunteer is my sense that I would say.
Okay, well, I'm going to hand the presenter role over to Mary now because she's going to close out, and perhaps she can answer that question when she opens her mic.
Yep, just trying to set up the slideshow here for the close. Monitor 2, okay. Sorry, I wasn't entirely prepared here. But in answer to the question about being an ATA member, I'm trying to think of a time when you wouldn't need to be an ATA member, and I'm really not coming up with anything. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think that that's something, well, if you have a question, just get in touch with me, mary@atanet.org, and maybe I can steer you to the right place. But, I want to thank Jamie, obviously, but while I was thinking about listening to Jamie, and I guess this kind of goes back to how volunteering can work for you, is that I got my job here at ATA, which is a job I dearly love, through the volunteer work that I was doing before I joined ATA. It was just building a skill set that ended up being exactly what ATA needed at the moment. So I think that, Jamie mentioned that, but it happens so often that I would certainly encourage people to look at it that way, as, and it was a career change for me, actually. I was going from one place to the other entirely, 180 degrees. So I, I think that's a good way of trying to figure out if you want to do something different. You know, trying it as a volunteer keeps you from quitting your day job, basically. I also want to go through two more webinars that we have. One is setting up a term base. And I know that we've had two other webinars by Barbara Inga Karsh, who's going to do this one. She's the terminology master guru out in the industry. And part of the deal is that people don't do this because they think it takes too much time. So Barbara has different tricks and ways of looking at it that make you realize or shows you how this can actually save you time and increase your productivity. So it's really good. She's a good speaker. I think you'll like it. The last webinar for the spring is Agencies versus Freelancers, a market analysis. And again, two excellent speakers. John Milan is actually the treasurer of ATA, and he has a degree in political economics. Can you imagine? But in any case, he's well-spoken, and he wants to look back at what's happened in the translation and interpreting industry to see how we can predict where it's going in the future. And I know that most of us, well, I think all members of the association have this need to understand where we are in the industry, because it's just not where we started. So I think, and that's true of a lot of industries, but John's the perfect person to look back. And then I wanted to remind everyone, we have the conference website up, so you can go ahead and reserve a room. New Orleans is a really fun time fun place and a fun time of the year to be down there. It's not too hot and it's not too cold, and it's right before Halloween. So there's just a lot of things going on, and we're going to have a great conference. I can tell you this. We have 170 sessions and we've had more than 350 proposals. So we will definitely be having the best of the best at that point. And finally, I want to remind everyone that we're here. You can reach me directly through webinars@atanet.org, but also mary@atanet.org. And again, if you have a question about volunteering, I might be able to steer you in the right place. I can certainly tell you who to talk to. And I think that getting started or having an in or knowing who to talk to is so important to making that first step. Also, all of our webinar recordings are at www.atanet.org/webinars. And we've got more than 70 recordings. There's something that I'm sure everyone would be interested in. And with that, I'm going to wish everyone a great day. Thank you for attending. Thanks, Jamie, again, for taking up the challenge of doing this volunteer presentation. And I hope all of you will come to a future webinar or just look back at the recordings and see what you might like. Have a great day.